Okay, so welcome everyone. Thank you so much for coming along to this Reframed event this evening. So this Reframed event is all about the ethics of anatomical collections. So my name is Kirsty Earley. I am the Digital Heritage and Engagement Officer here at the Royal College of Physicians and Surgeons of Glasgow. I'm going to pass to the panel to introduce themselves and tell us a bit about yourself. So Mike, how about we start with you?
Well, good evening, everybody. I'm glad you could join us. My name is Mike Rutherford. I'm the Curator of Zoology and Anatomy for the University of Glasgow Hunterian Museum. I'm fairly new to the post. I've only been here since March this year, but I'm also a fairly familiar with Glasgow University as I was a student there in the 1990s. But it's been a very great privilege to join the curatorial team at the Hunterian and to start taking part in events such as this.
Good evening, everyone. Very nice to see everyone. My name is Ianto, Jocks. I like Mike, was a student at Glasgow for many years. And I suppose I'm now more kind of independent scholar sort of person since graduating. My background is kind of medical history and anatomy, as well as sort of long-standing interest in the history of science. And in terms of the collections, I first really started working with the collections during my master's in anatomy and medical visualization, which was 2013-14 now. And since then, I've kind of kept working a little bit whenever I had some time on particularly John Cleland's collection, which Mike's going to talk about as well. So yeah, very much looking forward to this.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, guys. Oh, we're all Glasgow Glasgow students. I didn't know that. We're in a club. So let me just talk about our reframed events and why we're doing them at the college. So our reframed events are all around actually looking at our heritage and looking at it in a new light. So these events for us as heritage professionals will help us reveal our heritage in new ways to address issues of equality, diversity and inclusion. So we're reframing our heritage by acknowledging that inequality is embedded in our history. Heritage practice like museum displays, engagement, celebrations, etc., connects people to the past, but often ignores inequalities that are part of the story. So as a college, as with any medical college, anatomy is a significant part of our heritage, from its research to its teaching. Glasgow as a city has a fascinating medical heritage. If you don't know about it, I would definitely just go on the Google and put in Glasgow's medical heritage. You'll probably find a lot of great things. With many memorable figures in anatomy having studied in Glasgow, worked there and taught there. So people like William Hunter, Allan Burns, and also William Macewen. A common practice in medicine and surgery was the dissection, and still is, the dissection of human cadavers, and as a result, in the past, the collecting of human specimens. The college formally started a specimen collection in 1823 when the museum committee was formed to manage it, with a budget for its upkeep and a room to store it. This collection lasted until about 1852 when it was transferred to the Glasgow Royal Infirmary Pathological Museum, presumably because there was a lack of space in the then college building at St Enoch Square. So during this event, we want to look more closely at the context of anatomical collections, the heritage of them, discuss it and reframe it. So just a disclaimer, we will be discussing sensitive material on human remains, and there may be some language that is a bit, shall we say, outdated. But on that note, I will pass over to Mike to give us his presentation.
Well, as I said, good evening. So today, there's so much in the anatomy collection at the University of Glasgow, in the Anatomy Museum. But today I wanted to just really focus on one particular part of the collection, which is summarized in the Catalogue of Crania. So I'll just get on to show you what that's about. But before I do continue, I just want to carry on with what Kirsty was saying, an acknowledgement. As part of the university intent on carrying through reparations for the benefits accrued to it from slavery and racist violence, we commit to listening and understanding the desires of descendant and survivor communities in the return of ancestral remains. We further wish to repair, restore, and return the knowledge and skills that have been built at their expense doing so through durable and long-term exchanges. We acknowledge that our journey towards restitution has only just begun, and that we owe a debt of respect, care, honesty, and committed action to those who will hold us accountable in the process. And a warning that the following presentation contains dated language and terms that may cause distress or offence. Apologies in advance. So just a little bit of background. I'm sure many of you are aware of the history of the collections, but the origins of the Anatomy Museum collections obviously started with William Hunter, who gave his name to the current museum. And as a famous anatomist, man midwife, and collector, he assembled a wide range of anatomical and pathological specimens, casts and bones and skeletons that were all bequeathed to the university on his death, and then were kept as part of the anatomy department. These were added to over the years by the various Regius Professors of Anatomy and their staff, so starting with James Jeffrey in the 1790s. Went on to serve as the longest professor, I think, in Scottish history, and added many anatomical and pathological wet specimens. And is also very well famous for inventing the chainsaw and for some rather impressive galvanism experiments. And then moved on to Alan Thompson, and this is where the subject of tonight's talk, the specimens really started to be accumulated by Thompson. These were skulls and skeletons, and again, more comparative anatomy specimens. Thompson was as interested in animal anatomy as he was in human anatomy. And this was carried on by John Cleland. The comparative anatomy collections grew very large under his period, and he was keen on the skulls as well. So as you can see from the date 1909, that's when he wrote his paper, which I'm just about to talk about. And after him, there was Thomas Bryce, who was a bit of a crossover. He was in charge of the Hunterian Museum itself for a while, and as much of a archaeologist as an anatomist, and he added into the collection, I think, over 600 Scottish skulls. So we had a wide range of origins for the collection today. But what I want to talk about in particular this evening is the Catalogue of Crania, written by John Cleland and published in 1909. And it was a list of all the skulls, the human skulls that were in the anatomy department at that time. And this catalogue is widely available online. It's printed in full as a PDF on the Wellcome Trust website, and it has been used by various peoples to get in touch with the university asking after certain items, remains in it. But this is one to want to look at in more detail. So just to give you a little bit of background, the Anatomy Museum, although we're not open to the public at the moment, we were in the past, and there's a small display of some of the Cleland collection skulls. This includes a cast of King Robert the Bruce, a cast of Robert Burns's skull, a few skulls of medical interest showing various sort of deformities or ailments, a skull with phrenology markings on it, and many others, including some casts of human evolution skulls. But out of all the ones in the catalogue, this is only a tiny section of them. And this was put together by recently retired Stuart MacDonald, worked in the anatomy department, and Abigail Hefferman. This was all put together sometime in, I think, the 1990s, if I'm correct. So that's what the current display is like. Quite simple, quite basic. So getting into the catalogue itself, it was organised by Cleland in groups that he called cases. And I've still to sort of really get to the bottom of whether this refers to actual displays in the museum, if all the skulls were displayed. But as you can see here, they've got the case A was abnormal skulls. These were skulls of sort of medical interest, pathological interest. Then there's a listing of Irish skulls, British skulls, then anthropoid apes. So as I mentioned, there's this interest in comparative anatomy. And so there are skulls from gorillas, orangutans, and casts as well, just showing the similarities and differences. Case B was British skulls, and this what makes up the majority of the collection of British skulls. Obviously, they're the easiest ones for to acquire through the various methods, which I'll talk about soon. Case C was African, American, New Zealand. Then case D, Pacific Islands, Northern and European, Chinese and Tartars, old remains, archaeological remains as much, and then casts, as I mentioned, including Robert Burns and Robert the Bruce. And the KC, Australian, Malayan Islanders, Southern Pacific Islands, and India. So in general, the whole catalogue is organized into a continental or geographical structure. The origins of the skulls in the list, some were donations to the professors, donations to the department. This was fairly common. The department itself had its own obvious dissecting rooms, and some of the skulls came directly from there. There also came via graves and burial sites, taken and robbed and stolen and exhumated in various ways in various places. Some were purchased just directly from suppliers, and a couple came from executions and suicides, and also from war dead, from war trophies. And I'm just going to go through some of these just to give you an idea of what we're dealing with. So you can see many of these are gifts from colleagues and from students of the university and from military people. So just reading through some of the examples, these are just taken out directly as they are in the catalogue. So we've got first one, a large brachycephalic skull sent by an old student's friend, so not in any detail. Next, we have a couple of Native American peoples. This is presented by Professor Huntington and Principal Barclay, so obviously dealing with staff and academics and other institutions around the world. Next one down, Maori skulls from New Zealand from Dr. Guthrie. From the Mescaline Islands or New Hebrides from a Dr. Crombie by Maitland Ramsay. So you can see as well that there's chains of acquisition and people passing skulls from one person to the next before they ended up in Glasgow. Other ones here from Chinese, from Dr. Anderson and a Dr. Murray, and Australian one just from a student, and final one from Commander Balfour for the Royal Navy, and there were quite a few from him and from other Navy personnel. Obviously, with the British Navy being spread all over the world, they could reach many more remote places and use their connections to acquire various human remains from various places. As I said, there was also ones in the dissection room. You see the first entry here, one of the few human remains in the catalogue that actually has a name associated with it, Mary Gordon, but just described as female, old and toothless. I haven't been able to yet find out any more details about Mary Gordon. So again, there's many avenues of research coming out of the catalogue that will require a fair bit more work. But then other ones just describes a male from the dissecting room, no more information than that. And then not just the anatomy department in Glasgow's dissecting room, but also the one in Calcutta as part of the Indian Medical Service. And this is Mr. McCulloch passed on many skulls, many remains from Calcutta. And here you can see in the catalogue, they don't even get details. It's just where they came from and a number. And then final one, a bit more disturbing. I saw this one from a Negro, apparently 20 years, from body dissected in rooms. The pelvis is preserved, probably been a slave, 1886. That opens up many questions, obviously. But one particular one is the dates are a bit strange because slavery in the British Empire had been already outlawed and banned from the 1830s. So exactly what the story is behind this person, we don't know, but another one to investigate. This is where the ethical issues start coming in. Next, a few executions. First one, an Irishman executed in Scotland. This was the source of early medical and anatomical collections, largely in the 1700s, because it only legally come from people who'd been executed for murder. And this obviously didn't really happen that often, and so there was always a shortage of bodies, and this led to the various changes in the laws over the years, which ended up with bodies coming from various places, including from paupers and so on. There's also some criminals, well, not sure what they were guilty of, but from Burma, and they were executed in a rather horrific way, as evidenced in the photograph mentioned in the catalogue. And then their skulls were collected by Dr. Mackay and passed on. And you can see here, they just got notes about dolichocephalic and brachycephalic occipitals. And this is something that appears in the catalogue a lot, just mentioning kind of unusual features, unusual anatomical features in the skulls. Also, were a couple of suicides. There was a French sailor who killed himself by pistol shot in the harbour. And I'm assuming that it's just referred to as the harbour, that they meant in Glasgow and the Clyde. This was an Alan Thompson one, that was AT. And you can see here another fairly common standard in the catalogue is mentioning the capacity of the skull in cubic inches, this one being 79 cubic inches. This is a very common way of labeling and categorizing the skulls. And the second suicide was one of John Steele, one of the rare named peoples in the list. It's a very strange one. He was a bigger spiritualist who committed suicide in 1793 in philosophic ardor to become a medium between heaven, hell, and the earth. So when I first read this one, obviously it's quite a shock. But it seemed, this individual had chosen this task, as it were, and gone on to see what happened next. But then when we're looking through the archives and looking in particular in what was the Register for Anatomy Department written by Dr. Thompson, I came across this, and it changes the story somewhat. So if you can see here, I'll just carry on. JS was one of the biggest spiritualists who was chosen by the society to test the question of the immortality of the soul, and actually drowned himself with a view of returning and informing the fraternity what passed in the other world. He has not, however, been since heard of. And it changed quite a lot when it's no longer seemingly a kind of a choice, more he was chosen. So very interesting ethical questions raised there as well. Then quite a few of the remains in the collection were purchased. As you can see here, there's one of a Native American from Plum Creek, and the same obtained by purchase and presented by J.K. Caird. And another one from Mexico, young skull, and again obtained by purchase and presented by the same person. And then two other interesting ones that were not actual human remains, but casts of faces. These are plaster models, just written as cast of face of boss-chest man and cast of face of boss-chest female, as an old term for Khoisan peoples of southern Africa. And unfortunately, Khoisan were often the target and the interest of anatomists and people interested in human evolution and sort of the then growing movement of eugenics, looking at all the categories of man, as it were. But we found out that assuming anyway, that these casts actually came from the Phrenological Society in Edinburgh, who, as you can see here, had a list of items for sale: casts of crania, busts from nature, masks from nature. And you can see the close-up, they've got their boss-chest man, female, and male. Casts may be had from 2 shillings to 5 shillings each. But then it begs the question, where did they get the casts from? There's possibilities that these Khoisan peoples were amongst many who came and were part of tours around Europe, around the UK, and during at some point in these tours when they were being put on show, as it were, the casts might have been made. I did have an expert look at the casts, and he was more of the opinion that they were life masks. These were masks that were made in death. But again, an interesting story to find out more about, and again, raising all sorts of questions. Then there were quite a few war dead remains in the collection from the many battles that the British Empire fought in, started, the slaughters they conducted, and various other incidents all over the world. And here we have several from Africa, from the Gaika Rebellion, from Zulat killed at Isandlwana, from the Ashanti Wars, but also skull of a Russian soldier from the Crimean War. And this is actually one of the ones that's on display at the moment. One of the most common sources for many of these skulls, however, as I mentioned, was coming from graves and burial sites. Starting looking at graves in Ireland. There's Clare Galloway and Corcomru Abbey, and assuming that when those abbeys started to fall into disuse, that parts of them would be dug up and changed, and the various bodies that have been buried there in the past would come to light and seemingly shared and spread and given to various academics and interested people all over. There's also bones and skulls dug up from North America of Native Americans, First Peoples, Newfoundland, and an Eskimo skull. Quite specific details of where they came from, as is the one from New Zealand, number 154 there, saying someone dug up from a cave used as a burying place near Auckland. But also some more ancient ones, 2 skulls from Malta and 2 skulls actually excavated in the Great Pyramids. Again, we found out a bit more information about these in the register, and it was part of a collection of hundreds of skulls found in the same excavation. And the final one there, the dilapidated skull of an old man. This is one from a peat bog. So I'm assuming somewhere in Ireland or Scotland, possibly. Showing the excavations and burials from everywhere. So out of all these, what do we still have? Who do we still have? So of the 272 entries in the Catalogue of Crania, 261 are actual human remains. And when I was going through all the skulls in the collection in the Anatomy Museum, we were trying to find what we had. And it was pretty depressing kind of result. So you look here, we had, say, from Europe and unknown origins, we found 46 skulls, 76 still missing, and 5 possibilities, ones with further verification required. From Asia, we had 19, so with 39 not found. Africa, it was 7 located, with 17 missing. The Americas, it was 5 found, 7 missing, and 1 needing confirmation. And for Australasia and the Pacific, we got 18 skulls still remained, but 21 people missing. So overall, of 95 skulls out of 261, so, it's pretty much a third left, which is quite a shocking rate of loss from when this was written 112 years ago to now, to have lost 2/3 of the skulls. And we'll discuss sort of how that might have happened later. Out of all these remains, we have had 1 repatriation so far, hoping that this is the first of many. This was the head of a New Zealander, a Maori, a Moko Makai, as they're correctly called, and this was returned home to New Zealand in 2009. So that kind of leaves us with different sort of groups of human remains, of these ancestral remains. We have ones with provenance information. So we have records where we have the actual skull, and we have fairly detailed information based on the catalogue, based on registries and other literature. And these ones are fairly, hopefully, straightforward and possible to send back to their homes. We then have ones that are just a skull with very little information. It could be nothing more than a line in the catalogue saying from Calcutta or saying from a male, and that's it. So there's not as much chance or much hope for having a repatriation story for those ones. And then there's the ones that are mentioned in the catalogue, but we don't actually have them. These sort of ghost remains, as it were. And these are were in our collections, were in the University of Glasgow's care at some point, but have disappeared. And so those are 3 sort of main groups of what we're dealing with. This all kind of came about, this recent work, because we're part of a larger project. The Hunterian is involved in the Devolving Restitution African Collections in UK Museums Beyond London project. And what this is it brought together several big museums, kind of initiated by Pitt Rivers, and they asked all these different collections around the country to run workshops every couple of months for this year and next year, looking at a different aspect. And the Hunterian was asked to run the workshop on human remains, partly because of our extensive anatomy and archaeological collections. And so that's going to be happening on December 9th. And it's open to anyone to come and join us. Again, it will be an online talk like this one. And based on what we found in our collections, we decided to focus on the remains of people from Southern Africa, There's largely, again, Khoisan peoples. There was two Khoisan skulls found amongst our collections, as well as the two Khoisan face masks. But then in the archaeology collection, there's several more people, several more human remains being found. And this is very much part of our learning process as the museum, as to how we approach these delicate issues, how we start the process of repatriation, and how we take our next steps. But one thing I'd like to do, as well as this repatriation thing, is look at memorialization. As many of you will know, the recent donors to the anatomy department are remembered in an annual ceremony, which actually just took place 2 nights ago for this year. And this is a very moving ceremony where members of the public whose relatives, friends donated their bodies for cadavers are invited along to the university chapel, and there's ceremonies and service and singing choir and so on. And it's a chance to sort of thank these people, to thank their relatives for their donations. And what I'd like to do is sort of possibly extend that and rehumanize the remains of those who are in the collection without consent, people who are obviously stretching back over the last couple of 100 years, whose body parts have ended up either in jars or as skeletal remains, but they had no chance to give the permission. And the creation of some kind of memorial to these people, whether that take the form of a statue, a plaque, a garden, I don't know. This is very much a kind of just a work in progress, and something that we need much more feedback for. And so the Hunterian itself obviously has policies in place. We have a repatriation policy, and we have a human remains policy, which we've just recently updated, and that is reviewed every 5 years. And we also have put out a list of all the human remains in our collections, which roughly stands at about 4,500 individual items, and connected to thousands of people. All of this is available to view online. The address there, basically look for the Hunterian web pages and looks for our reports and policies. So I just wanted to finish. It's very much just, I wanted to give you a snapshot of part of the collection and then bring forward the ethics for discussion. I'm just wanting anyone to sort of ask. I don't have many answers. I have many questions. First one really being, where are the missing remains? What happened to the 2/3 of the skull collection? Where did they end up? Possibilities include, giving them out to other departments, other professors, other lecturers around the country. Students using them, some of them being broken, some of them being disposed of. Who knows? There's still much to be discovered there. And then on the flip side of that, how do we acknowledge those ghost remains, the ones that are in our records, in our registries, but not actually have a physical presence, but we still need to acknowledge that they were here at some point. How do we store the remains from different cultural belief systems? At the moment, all our skulls are in what are called skull boxes, is the term for a perfectly sized box, cardboard box that each skull goes in, and then they're in locked wooden cabinets, all treated basically in the same way. But are there more specific things that some cultures would like to see happen with their ancestors? Repatriation requests are encouraged, but how do we raise awareness of these remains that we have? We're just one small museum and one part of Europe, and how do people whose ancestors might be here find out about that? So that's something we have to work on. And also one of the biggest kind of contentious ethical issues from a science point of view is our unlabeled skulls. We have many that have no provenance, no details. There are methods that are used to narrow down where skulls could come from. The techniques of getting ancient DNA out of skeletal material have advanced greatly over the last few years, and that could really pin down to some degree of accuracy where a skull must come from. Same with isotopic analysis using remnants of bone. But in order to do that, you need to potentially take part of the skull, a small part of the bone. And generally, you don't do that unless you have the permission of the cultural group, the society, the peoples, where this person came from. But because we don't know where the person came from, we can't get the permission. And so it's just stuck in this kind of a vicious circle, a catch-22 situation, as it were. And all these many questions we have still to figure out. And I'm hoping the more discussions we have like this tonight, the more we can go towards finding solutions.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Mike. Thanks so much for that really interesting talk. It just, as you said, it just raises so many questions, and obviously some of them we will discuss just now from your list. But also, if anyone else has any comments or questions, yes, please feel free to put them in the chat. So for context, we all have it, the three of us, we all have experience with anatomy, with anatomical collections. Ianto and I did the same masters at different years, and then I did a undergrad before that. So just to start with the discussion, can you give an example of a case when you were working with anatomical collections that raised ethical questions? So Ianto, specifically, because obviously Mike has talked about some that he's come across with in his work, but yeah, you and your work and your research as well.
Yes, so if I can briefly add, as Mike was saying, Cleland's collection is the skulls on the one hand, and then the mainly wet specimens, but comparative anatomy really was the bulk of the collection. Now, one of the reasons why there's so much comparative anatomy is because that was integrated into the medical teachings. So these weren't really intended as collections for zoology students. These were for the medical students. And when Cleland gifts his collection to the university before he retires, and he very much makes it clear that it's a teaching collection and that it's available for educational purposes is a stipulation. So of this collection, we kind of have a lot of the same issues and same themes emerging as we have with the skulls. Again, I really like this idea of the ghost specimen, and it's one thing I find very interesting with the other part of Cleland's collection as well. Again, he writes a catalog. In the catalog, 1,000 specimens are mentioned. We have maybe a little bit more than half, I think. And of those, we have mainly the comparative anatomy ones, although a couple of the human ones remain as well. There are also mounted skeletons, a couple of casts, all sorts of things. But those tend to not survive. And in contrast to the skulls, virtually everything we have is on display in the Anatomy Museum, although without really any context. And we might end up talking a little bit about the issues of displaying specimens without context, especially when they're ethically problematic. We have similar issues with the provenance. Some of the specimens were just found in stock jars on the shelves, as Cleland describes them. So even at the time, they didn't know where they were from. A lot of the specimens are described in a lot of detail in terms of why they're anatomically interesting, but we don't really have much information on where they're from. Some of them similarly are gifts. Some of them are from clinical practice. Some of them are just found. A lot of the same issues with provenance, with the specimens where we have varying degrees of detailed description, but we don't know where the specimen is. I suppose in terms of the kind of drawing this back towards the ethics, I think what strikes me about the collection is kind of what comes back to what's and I should say with the catalog, whereas the skull catalog is very organized, the catalog is all over the place. So you have to physically go through it. There's no system in it. It was recatalogued later, and it was all systematized then. But you have the eye of an ox, and then next you have various other exotic animals, and you have things like there's a fish that he found decomposing in the snow on a Christmas walk right next to some kind of very exotic animal parts sent from similarly from students all over the world. One of the things that really strikes me is the extent of what Cleland calls monstrosities. So as kind of illustrated with the idea of the abnormality of skulls at the start of the skull catalogue, Cleland is very interested in what's called teratology, which literally is the study of monsters. So he was interested particularly in birds which had additional limbs. There's reference to a couple of like cyclopedian animals. There's a couple of animals with one head and two bodies. It's mostly lambs, kittens, puppies, and also various human fetal malformations. And I think that's kind of that's a different from there are some hints of the similar issue with race and ethnicity that we get with these collections, but there's kind of the converse that you mentioned, kind of traveling shows that to me evokes more the kind of what was called the freak show, the traveling carnival, the cabinet of curiosity kind of spectacle aspect of anatomy. And from the descriptions, I really do want to believe that it's a scientific interest. It's an interest in why do these things happen, comparing different types, classifying everything. But it does kind of beg the question, how do we approach this sort of thing? And there's a lot of similar specimens or some similar specimens in Hunter's collection as well. So how do we then approach this very thin line between the educational, kind of what it tells us about mutation, reproduction, development, and kind of avoiding turning the museum again into some sort of sensationalist kind of freak show? I think to me, this out of all there are other issues that could be mentioned. There's one specimen that's come from an asylum. There's one specimen where he calls it an imbecile dwarf, which again is a very outdated, very unfortunate expression.
This is something that has all been brought up in our own discussions in Hunterian, is how to describe and refer to these people, these remains in our catalogues, because a lot of the time I sort of found this with the skulls, where you've actually got written on the side of the skulls in Indian ink a description like that, sort of whether it's of imbecile or some racial characteristic. And when you're describing something in the catalogue, you kind of you have to say what is written on it, and so you have to put those words and use those words in the catalogue. But then we also have sections in our database where it's okay, so that is a term used in the past, but then we might have what the most up-to-date accepted term may be for a particular group, such as using Khoisan instead of Bushman, and all these things are they're very, very you have to be dealt with very delicately. I think as Irana asking this question about sort of ethical diversity and inclusion language, and it's something we're very aware of, and having that fine balance between describing what's there and also describing how it was described in old catalogues, in old registers, so that you have a full record and a full history of it is necessary. But then you don't want that to be the first thing that people come across if they're going to look at it on an online catalogue, for example. Like I said at the beginning of this talk, you need to have a warning, because it could be very off-putting for somebody who's wanting to come and research from something, and suddenly they're presented unexpected with all these terms that are very offensive, and so it is a serious issue.
Yeah. To go back, Jan, to what you're saying about the fine line, I feel like just looking at the history of anatomy, you know that it has places that are very dark. I think we know that as anatomists and people that work in it. But also just in general with medical collections, medical heritage, I think there's an awareness, very much an awareness of the fact that actually in the history, these could have been seen as kind of curiosities and done for entertainment purposes, for whatever reason. And that, I think that is still, I'm not saying that's what people do today, but that awareness of like the curiosities is still there today. And you know that it could bring in audiences, but obviously ethically, when you look at medical collections, you know, especially us at the college, we know that you can make things fantastical with surgical instruments and knives and saws in the collections, but actually it's actually looking at it of like, you know, let's look at this rationally and not kind of try and glamorize it.
I think the interpretation and the context are very important. I think as we're sort of going there, Alison asking, displaying actual specimens versus displaying casts, and both can be displayed, but I think both, you know, you treat them in the same way. We treat those casts of the two Khoisan people's faces in the same way as we treat actual human remains, and that is the sort of the same way that the sort of communities would want them to be looked after. They're more emotive. When I first opened up the box and saw these face casts, you're looking straight into at a person. When you're looking at a skull, or you're looking at a spleen in a jar, it's quite different. It doesn't sort of, you know, raise that same emotion. But yeah, and I think with both of them, yes, there's a lack of consent issue with much of our historical collection, but I think it's as important to tell these stories, tell these people's stories as lessons, as, you know, sort of as opening up our history and not hiding away from it. But there are other ways of doing that as well. You know, you can talk about them like I did tonight, or showing excerpts from a registry rather than actual showing the actual skull or the actual remains themselves. To, you know, be more sort of honoring the peoples. But yeah, it's a very tricky thing. You don't want to hide stuff away and pretend it's not there. You don't want to sort of put it out there and let anybody make of it what they will. Everything has to be carefully thought through as to how their story is told.
Yeah, definitely. So to go back to another question as well, with regards to finding the origins of anatomical specimens, where we can, should an effort be made to find, you know, the origins, cultural origins of specimens, and if so, is there a line that needs to be drawn to keeping the specimen or to disposing of it? And that's to either of you.
I think in general, certainly my understanding is that we do try to chase up the provenance in, and Mike was looking at explaining some of the avenues where we can try and find a little bit more in registers and different catalogs, kind of doing a bit more research around it, and then raising the question of should we do destructive analysis. I think as long as we accept that we might have a very limited success rate, that at the end of the day, the answer is just going to be, we don't know. There's no way for us to find out. Sometimes there's not even something we could reasonably speculate. I think when I looked at this, kind of thinking about this question, the question of what do we mean by do we want to keep specimens, and what do we mean by disposal, and kind of similar to the kind of the vital importance of having context for things which we do display, having a sort of curation of where do we decide that maybe we shouldn't be putting this on display, but we should still make it so I think one of the advantages that in some papers where it's cited that why we should keep old collections is that depending on when they were made, we get catalogs of anatomical variations, which you don't really get very much because you randomly find them. We get things like diseases which are now eradicated. So from a kind of history of medicine perspective, and also from a kind of clinical database, it's quite interesting. So while some of them we might not necessarily want to have in a display case, we might still use them either as a research source, or in German there's a word called Mahnmal, and it's kind of like a memorial, but it really is a memorial of, look what horrible thing we've done. And
Yeah.
so a kind of a reminder of, okay, this dates to this time, and we shouldn't just get rid of it because it's uncomfortable.
It's like you've got this legacy, and you have
so
to
you
accept
need
it.
to
You have to take on the burden, as it were, of dealing with the terrible things that have happened in the past, and you can't just brush it under the carpet. You can't just bury it, dispose of it, give it away. Even if the bodies, even if the skulls and the sort of ancestor remains are repatriated, we still have a duty at the university, the Hunterian, to keep on acknowledging and accepting that yes, this happened and that we were part of it as an institution. Yeah, sort of going around. I was asking, sort of talk about perhaps we can learn a lot from material culture, where objects are analyzed using both inherent and acquired values, with the latter focusing on social, ethical, cultural parameters. So yeah, this is sort of something that's come up, I think, if I'm getting it the right angle here, with some of the groups that, not just the Hunterian, but other museums have approached about repatriation of objects, repatriation of ancestral remains. Some of them, they don't want, like I said, sort of Indian ink labels or anything that are on the remains taken off, because that's part of the story of the object. It's the history of that person, and sometimes that's their full story, and trying to pretend that these parts didn't happen does a disservice to these people. But again, that varies case by case, depending on the culture, depending on the society. And this is one of the sort of the biggest issues with any repatriation, is that how it's dealt with varies hugely across the world. And there's sort of sometimes fairly straightforward, but sometimes there's a lot more work that has to be done both before, during, and after the process.
And I think that kind of ties into what you were saying about the rehumanization, that there's a similar sort of, this idea of disposal is kind of very dehumanizing. So in the attempt of how do we then confront this issue of we're having these ethically problematic collections, but the idea of disposing of them is in itself kind of dehumanizing. And I've kind of what struck me when kind of looking at accounts of how when there were surveys done of how medical schools were dealing with their anatomical collections, and they would just be put into the medical waste if there wasn't any more use for them. And I find that very upsetting, this idea that and I think you were saying in a different conversation about that there's a different, that when you look at something like a skull or a skeleton versus when you look at a spleen in a jar, there's a sort of a different response in this idea of one is human remains and one is medical waste.
When I was at university being taught by professors, they would say, we used to be able to take skulls and skeletons, skeletal tissue home to study them. And it was just, to us, obviously, as students, that was baffling, because we're like, no, we can't do that. But that wasn't even that long ago that kind of stopped.
I started medicine when I went to university. Fortunately, I became a curator instead. But no, I remember getting my box of bones for first year medicine, and going back to halls, and you sort of take it out and look at the various features in the bones and try and remember all the unusual names of the parts and so on. And then in the anatomy department, we have hundreds of these boxes. sitting there, and yes, it's a big question. They're not used as much as they used to be. They're not given the same way, and so then it becomes a question: what do we do with them? Do we just have rooms full of boxes of bones?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. We've had, might just make this the last question. We've had a question from Malcolm McCallum. So at the Edinburgh Anatomical Museum, they're being a lot more open and about their skulls and phrenology collection. I actually had a look at your new digital exhibition today. It's very, very good and very great to see how open you guys are being. In the past, there's been people quite against anti-repatriation. So, Mike, in general, if that you come across someone like that in your team, is there a way to go about that?
We haven't yet. I mean, very much as I think the Hunterian ethos at the moment is being very open, being wanting to repatriate. You're looking at everything in a case by case basis, and it really comes down to for us, it's sort of what the objects are, and looking at some of the remains we have, and how they haven't been used, they haven't been examined, they haven't been put on display, they haven't been studied, nothing has happened to them for decades, and it then becomes, why do we still have them? I know that this is kind of goes against the very heart and ethos of museums and curators in some ways, the old-fashioned sort of view anyway, of we have to keep everything forever. And then it becomes, well, we've been looking after these items, these people for a while, but how does it benefit us? And would it benefit the source communities more to return them? And generally, the answer that these days is yes. It's going to be better for relations, for mental health of peoples and places which have been so suffering in the past and still suffer now because of what we, as the British Empire, did. And yeah, it's something that I think the tide has changed. In anatomy collections here. But then it does, there is always that worry, I think, amongst sort of certain professionals of like that kind of, opening the door to everything disappearing, and then what are you left with? And I can understand that as well. But, there's, like I said, so many of our collections, so many of the anatomy remains have no provenance, have no history.
Yeah.
We don't know where they came from, and there's little to no chance at all of finding out, their origins. So, but there were a few specimens, a few human remains that have very specific places they came from. And like I showed in the catalogue, some of these were just taken straight from graves, just robbed, stolen, and we have a duty to return them.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's a very good note to end the discussion for now. I know that the three of us could talk for hours on anatomy, if people let us, but I feel like we have to cut it short sometimes. But yeah, thank you both so much just for being part of this event and for your talking through for your expertise as well. We're always keen to have conversations like this and also continue with it as well. Yeah, I think that's it. So on that note, thank you all for attending, and we hope this has been challenging in a good way, and it'll leave you with more questions than answers, as it has us. But yes, I hope you have a nice rest of your evening, and thank you again.